I have a question. Is there anybody from the press in this room? Anybody? There is. Very good. I was concerned because unless there's a member of the press, nothing that's said outside of this room is going to go anywhere other than where you send it. So be sure to talk to your friends and neighbors, get on your blogs, get on Facebook, and let people know what you've heard here today. Our next guest, Gretchen Lowe.
How many of you have heard that education is data-driven and that data is king in making educational decisions today? Data, data, data. The driving force behind Common Core standards is the ability to have common codes or standards or assessments to track students that are now known as human capital, in their schooling and into the workforce and into the rest of their life. Your current educational models are based on business models, and students are now assessed on their competencies, and the data sets will note their strengths and or weaknesses based on the assessments adopted by these two private organizations that Dr. Stotsky talked about. The assessments are not set by your local district, your school, or your state. They may or may not reflect your community standards, and they might not even be an accurate assessment of the child. But this is the data set that will be following your student through his or her life. As Dr. Stotsky said, this has been going on for quite a while. I came across a document. It's from the ESP Solutions Group. ESP Solutions is a data management company that has worked with the U.S. Department of Education for many, many years. They prepared a brochure or a report, and this was back in 2006, and they had prediction, a 10-year prediction on 2016 on the future of education with the data. And it talks about the importance of data-driven education and why it's necessary to track human capital. I'll just read a little bit of it. This is the cost-benefit analysis, the return on investment, and they're talking about students. Human capital are now return on investment in education. The prediction: we will begin to see education programs being evaluated, not merely on effectiveness, but also on the results they return for the dollars expended. As cold as this seems, the continual pressure to justify the cost of education, to find ways to stretch finite resources to achieve the greatest learning, and the demand by parents that their students get the most value possible from their investment of time in a school will push this methodology. So what we have here is that education has changed from being an opportunity to now a program based on centralized common outcomes and measuring your students' return on investment by government dollars. So Governor Nixon, Commissioner Castro, and the State Board of Education signed a Memorandum of Understanding, which is also known as an MOU. Once you start writing about all this stuff, you get all these acronyms in your head, and you have to remember that that's not everybody's life, but it is mine, but it's a MOU. They signed it with the Smarter Balance Consortia. That's the consortia that we are in. There are two main consortia of states. We are Smarter Balance, and we are in with 25 other states. It's a 26-state consortia. Our consortia is controlled by Washington State. So we don't have any more Missouri standards. They call them Missouri Learning Standards now, but as Dr. Stotsky said, they're not really our standards, they're Common Core standards. So they signed this MOU in May 2010, and it allowed individual student, teacher, and principal data to be released to the consortia. Now before this time, any information had been aggregate information. In other words, you would send reports into the federal government or your state agency, and it would be, how is your school doing, how is a subgroup doing, how is your district doing. There was not any personal identifiable information. Now we have this MOU, says we can take this information and give it to the consortium. Then the consortia signs an agreement in January 2011 with the Federal Department of Education, which allowed the streaming of this individual data to the Department of Education and whoever the Department of Education wants to share it with. And the Department of Education has stated that it will share individual student data and teacher and principal data to various federal agencies such as Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, Department of Defense. And the really interesting thing that they put in is that they will take your students' data and be able to give it to any third-party research or private organization that the Department of Education deems appropriate. So you don't know where your student data is going. You have no control over it. Now, the commissioner stated in the hearing in House Bill 616 that it is not DESE's intent, that's the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, it is not her intent to release individual student data. But DESE is bound by the MOU it signed with our consortia. And the consortia is bound by the MOU that it signed with the Department of Education. So in the long run, DESE's going to have to abide by the mandates from the Department of Education. So while it may not be her intent, she is bound by those mandates. So the questions are, who is controlling what data is being gathered? For an initiative that touts itself as state-led, it sure seems like the federal government has the final say in gathering student data. Where is the data being channeled? I just said that it's going to be shared with various federal agencies and third parties. Did your school or your school district or your state get your permission that the data on your student could be gathered and shared with these entities? DESE states it's currently gathering 61 data points on Missouri students. We only found that out through the House Bill 616 hearing. So my question is this a DESE, a Smarter Balance, or federal government directive? What are the data points? Did you know these 61 data points are being gathered on your student? And I think the most important question for me, by crossing the threshold of a public school building, does that act of walking into a school give the federal government the permission to access your student's personal data? Should you as a parent have the authority to not allow the data gathering of your minor child? I think what I am just totally shocked is that everybody gets very upset about Facebook privacy. And you get upset which with good reason, if your bank account gets compromised and that information gets out there. But there is no outcry of your student, and it's not going to be just your student, it's also going to be family data that's eventually going to be gathered. And that's going out under the radar in a stealth manner, and you don't even know it, and you didn't give permission. So I think most of you in Missouri are familiar with the Department of Revenue problems that they're having with their gathering data on concealed carry permit holders. And that data was sent to Homeland Security without the permission of the concealed carry permit holder. So if you think about it, these educational MOUs were signed without legislative or parental knowledge. And an important thing to understand is that the MOUs, they're not contracts. And Common Core is not a law. These are agreements with private organizations that have been funded with stimulus dollars. So everybody thinks this is a law like No Child Left Behind, but it's not. If you didn't like No Child Left Behind, the one good thing that you can say about it is that Congress voted on it. so it was a law. This was a crisis, like all the other crises that we have been in for the last several years. You know, energy and job and economy and everything has to be fixed. So what Congress did is they gave Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, a check for $4.35 billion. And they said, go fix education. So this is what we got. And if you think about how this process, why it bypassed legislative approval, the Department of Education is like the EPA. They are agencies. But how has the EPA been operating? It's been just doing a lot of regulatory stuff. So this is how Common Core is. It's just a bunch of regulations, it's mandates, it's not law. But this is an example of how DESE and the governor got around the budget process for individual data gathering and dissemination, and the federal government's expansion of public-private partnerships in education. Well, DESE has been using existing funding for the expansion of the data gathering, and when the federal funding, the stimulus money, runs out in 2014, we've been informed that DESE will present a budget to the state, and that's expected to be north of $350 million for the Common Core implementation, which includes the data expansion. And this $350 million is on top of the existing budget now. So you all are going to have to find a lot of money. This data will eventually be merged into the longitudinal data system. I'm sure most of you have heard about the 350, 400 data points. The longitudinal data system houses the personal student data sets. Now, the MOUs are presently being crafted to agree to this data gathering, but there have been some legal issues raised. Arnie Duncan tweaked the Federal Education Rights Privacy Act, FERPA, and FERPA is supposed to protect student privacy, and that was a congressional act. But he went in, and just like everything else, he kind of tweaked it to allow all these personal data sets to be disseminated. But the EPIC group that's out of New York City, they have filed a lawsuit that is in federal court. That has not happened yet. But as I said, there are MOUs being crafted, ready to be signed. So if EPIC loses or whatever, then that's when you're going to see that really massive personal data start going out on kids. So basically what I want to say tonight is that Common Core allows for the common data sets necessary to provide a managed workforce and determine the best return of investment. And the real reason of a data-driven education can be summed up in Arnie Duncan's own words from a conference where he talked about the importance of data information and data setting the trajectory of a student's life. And he said, hopefully someday we can look at a child in the eye at the age of 8, 9, or 10 and say, you are on the track to be accepted and succeed in a competitive university. And if you keep working hard, you will absolutely be there. But my question is, what happens to the 8, 9, or 10-year-old who is a late bloomer? If he or she doesn't have a great data set by age 10, what expectations would Secretary Duncan have for that child based on his or her data? Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen.